Why would one man decide to exterminate an entire people? What kind of hatred could possibly justify a world of gas chambers, death trains, and millions of lives extinguished by a cold, industrial system? This is the haunting question at the heart of the origin of the Holocaust. A question that isn't just about history, but about the very nature of human darkness. When we look back at the absolute horror of that era, it's tempting to simply label Hitler a madman and close the book. But that doesn't explain how 6 million Jews, roughly 1/3 of the world's Jewish population, were wiped out by a calculated, bureaucratic machine. Before we dive into this story that will send chills down your spine, subscribe to our channel and join us as we investigate the stories history doesn't want us to forget. Your support helps us keep the responsibility of memory alive. To truly understand this abyss, we have to decipher the logic of evil. You see, Hitler wasn't born with a heart full of hatred. He was once just a young man with a shattered dream of being an artist. What's truly terrifying is that he wasn't just a random lunatic. He built a systematic obsession, an ideological psychology so consistent that it persuaded Germany, then the most intellectual nation on earth, to justify the unthinkable. He didn't just hate, he practiced what he called rational anti-Semitism, turning an entire people into a scapegoat for a nation's failures. So, what transformed a failed artist into a monster, driven by a genocidal obsession? Let's dive into the darkest chapters of history to find out. To understand the origin of the Holocaust, we have to go back to 1907. Imagine an 18-year-old Adolf Hitler arriving in Vienna with a suitcase full of hopes and drawings. He didn't want to be a dictator. He wanted to be a famous painter. But the Vienna Academy of Fine Arts saw things differently. They rejected him, not just once, but twice, telling him his work lacked talent. For a young man with a massive ego, this wasn't just a no, it was a crushing humiliation. Experts like Rabbi Raphael Shore point out that Hitler wasn't a madman with a random grudge. His ideological psychology began to form as he wandered the streets, homeless and sleeping on benches. Instead of admitting he wasn't a great artist, Hitler looked for someone to blame. He needed a scapegoat, a person or group to take the fall for his own failures. But why did he pick the Jews? He didn't come up with the idea on his own. He found his blueprint in a man named Karl Lueger, the charismatic mayor of Vienna. Lueger was a master at using hatred as a political tool to unite the masses. He realized that if you give people a common enemy to look down on, they will follow you anywhere. Even though Lueger had Jewish friends in private, he openly used anti-Semitic slogans to win votes. Hitler took notes. He saw that words could move the masses and that organized hatred was a way to seize power. At that time, Vienna was a boiling cauldron of tensions. The city was a melting pot of different cultures, and the air was thick with conspiracy theories. In every cafe and cheap pamphlet, Jews were being blamed for everything from the degeneracy of modern art to the loss of traditional values. This environment educated Hitler, giving him a vocabulary for his rage. He began to believe the lie that his lack of success wasn't his fault. It was a conspiracy against the German people. By the time he left Vienna, the failed artist was gone. In his place was a man who had learned how to turn personal resentment into a political weapon. But how did this emotional hatred transform into a cold, calculated system that a whole nation would follow? If Hitler's hate was just personal, it might have died with him. But he claimed his anti-Semitism was rational. What was the terrifying logic he used to convince millions that destroying a people was saving humanity? Solving the haunting mystery of why Hitler hated the Jews requires looking deeper than a personal whim, uncovering an obsession that even the world's most intellectual nation found persuasive. If he were just a lunatic, why did Germany, the most intelligent, academic, and sophisticated nation in the world at the time, follow him into the abyss? The truth is much more chilling. Hitler didn't see himself as an emotional hater. He called himself a rational anti-Semite. In his mind, he wasn't just a dictator. He was a man on a mission to save humanity from what he considered a bad ideology. While emotional anti-Semitism is about gut-level dislike or prejudice, rational anti-Semitism was a systematic ideological psychology. He believed that the Jewish people had introduced a virus into the world that was weakening the human race, and that virus was what we call the human concept. Think about the values we cherish today: morality, equality, human rights, and the idea that we should love our neighbor. Hitler viewed these as weak values that went against the laws of nature. He believed in a world of social Darwinism, where might makes right and the strong should naturally destroy the weak. To Hitler, the Jewish invention of ethical monotheism, the idea that there is one God and every human being has inherent worth, was a conspiracy to enfeeble the strong, pure Aryan race. This is the logic of evil that many textbooks skip over. He saw himself as the redeemer who would strip away these humane layers to return the world to the natural order of the animal kingdom, where only the fittest survive. As Rabbi Raphael Shore explains, Hitler's hatred was rooted in this deep tension between Judaism's values and his own dark vision for Western civilization. But how did a nation of poets and philosophers actually buy into this? They didn't see it as murder. They saw it as a war to protect their civilization from degeneration. By framing the human concept as a foreign threat, Hitler made his followers feel like they were heroes protecting their families. This leads us to a terrifying realization. When a society begins to value strength over humanity, the unthinkable becomes rational. Hitler had the theory, and he had the target, but he still needed a catalyst. A massive national trauma that would make the German people desperate enough to turn this theory into a bloody reality. We've seen the logic behind the hate, but theories don't usually lead to gas chambers on their own. What was the spark that finally ignited this ideological poison? If Hitler's rational anti-Semitism was the engine of his hate, then social Darwinism was the fuel. He didn't just wake up one day and decide to be a villain. He built his world on a twisted version of science. You've probably heard of survival of the fittest in nature, where the lion hunts the gazelle to keep the pride strong. But Hitler took this idea and applied it to human beings in the most absolute horror way possible. He believed in a might makes right philosophy. To him, there was no such thing as inherent human rights or loving your neighbor. As Rabbi Raphael Shore explains, Hitler viewed the world as a ruthless hierarchy, where the strong were supposed to destroy the weak to ensure the evolution of the human race. He saw the Jewish people as the ultimate threat because they introduced the human concept, values like equality and compassion, which he believed weakened the strong Aryan race. To Hitler, getting rid of the weak wasn't a crime. It was a natural necessity. But how did he get a whole nation to buy into this? He needed a moment of peak national humiliation, and he found it at the end of World War I. Imagine Hitler in 1918, temporarily blinded by mustard gas in a hospital bed, hearing that Germany had surrendered. He couldn't accept it. To him, the German army was undefeated on the battlefield, so the loss had to be a betrayal. This birthed the stab in the back myth, a toxic conspiracy theory claiming that Jews and communists at home had sabotaged the country. It didn't matter that 100,000 Jewish soldiers had served Germany loyally. The lie was a perfect scapegoat for a country suffering from breadlines and massive debt. While locked away in prison later for a failed coup, he poured all this rage into his book, Mein Kampf, My Struggle. It wasn't just a manifesto of hate. It was a cold, calculated blueprint. In its pages, he mapped out his plan for Lebensraum or living space, which meant invading other countries to give the superior race more room, while systematically planning the eradication of those he deemed inferior. He had the ideology, he had the theory, and now he had a plan. But how do you go from a book written in a prison cell to a government-run death factory? How did the Nazis use law to strip away a person's humanity before they ever reached a gas chamber? That's where the story gets truly chilling. When Hitler took power, his rational anti-Semitism stopped being just a collection of angry speeches in beer halls and became the official law of the land. This is the part of the origin of the Holocaust that is truly chilling because it shows how a modern civilized society can slowly be turned into a machine designed to destroy. It didn't start with the gas chambers. It started with the systematic stripping away of a person's humanity, a process we call dehumanization. At first, the changes seemed small. Jews were banned from public office, then they weren't allowed to marry Germans, and eventually they were forced to wear the Star of David. Nazi propaganda used movies and posters to portray Jewish people as rats or parasites that were threatening the purity of the German race. As Rabbi Raphael Shore points out, this was a calculated ideological psychology designed to make the public see their neighbors not as human beings with feelings, but as a problem that needed to be solved. By the time the physical violence began, the population had been trained to look away. By 1942, this hatred was funneled into what the Nazis called the final solution. This wasn't just a series of random killings. It was an industrial genocide machine. The Nazis built factories of death like Auschwitz, where the process was as cold and organized as a car assembly line. People were transported on death trains, separated into groups and sent into gas chambers with a bureaucratic efficiency that leaves a permanent scar on human history. By the time the war ended, 6 million Jews had been murdered. 1/3 of the world's Jewish population was simply gone. What makes this even more terrifying is that the Holocaust didn't succeed just because of one madman. It succeeded because of the complicity of ordinary people, doctors who helped with selection, engineers who designed the ovens, and the indifference of the masses who stayed silent while their neighbors disappeared. It is a haunting reminder that when we stop seeing the divine spark in each other, the abyss is never far away. But the story doesn't end in the ashes of the camps. How did the survivors find the strength to start over when everything they knew was destroyed? And more importantly, what does never again actually mean for us today in a world that still struggles with division and hate? In the end, the most powerful truth isn't just that the regime fell, but that their ideology failed to erase the human concept they hated so much. Today, the continued existence of the Jewish people, and every group once targeted, stands as a living victory over that absolute horror. But the origin of the Holocaust teaches us that we cannot afford to be complacent. Evil doesn't begin with gas chambers. It begins in the mind, through the rationalization of hate and the gradual normalization of prejudice. To ensure these darkest chapters never return, we must stay alert to the warning signs of dehumanization and division in our own world today. Remembering is not just about looking at the past. It is an active responsibility of memory to protect the inherent worth of every human being. What do you believe is our most important duty in keeping the promise of never again alive today? Share your perspective in the comments below. If this deep dive helped you understand the why behind history's most haunting questions, please subscribe to the channel. Thank you for watching until the very end. See you in the next one.